Welcome, everyone. I think we're going to get started. I see people are still joining us, but we only have an hour for this, and we want to make sure we have enough time, to get through the presentation, the webinar, and then have time for Q&A. It's really nice to see so many familiar names and faces joining us today, and I'm really excited to launch this book with my colleagues who are presenting here today, and to have a very special host for this event, which I'll introduce in a minute. This is a webinar on the new book, Adaptation Urbanism and Resilient Communities. There are 4 authors. Unfortunately, the publisher would only let 2 of us have our names on the cover, myself and Billy Fields. But Liliane Geerling and Tolford were very instrumental in putting this book together. The book is about transforming our streets to address climate change, which we're going to talk about. A couple of housekeeping notes. This is approved for 1 credit for AICP CM. With AICP CM credits, you have to go on there and report it yourself into the system. And it is being sponsored by the Broward section of the American Planning Association. So if you go onto the website and look for APA Broward section in Florida, you should be able to find it. Please submit questions using the chat feature, and you can see down here it shows you, what the little chat box looks like. Go ahead and put your questions in there, and we will get to them at the end. So what I'd like to do is I would like to thank our sponsors and partners for this event. I'm going to let Reid Ewing, Professor Reid Ewing, he's a distinguished professor at the University of Utah. I'm sure you all know of Reid and his work. He's going to be our celebrity host today, and so I thank Reid for that. I knew Reid from Rutgers University when he was on my dissertation committee, and I've enjoyed working with Reid many times over the years on many different projects. I want to just make special mention of our sponsors. So I already mentioned the Florida chapter and the Broward section. Thanks to them again for sponsoring the CM credits. Also, the Treasure Coast section here up in Palm Beach County and to the north of us here. I'm in West Palm Beach, and where our FAU is based in Boca Raton. So thank them. I want to thank a lot of my old friends and colleagues and the Louisiana chapter of the American Planning Association who's sponsoring this. I see Bruce there and others. It's good to see you. And I'll be back in New Orleans in June for the National Hurricane Conference, so I might see some of you, which is going to be in person, actually. Texas State University and the International Sustainable Transportation Program, Transportation Choices for Sustainable Communities Research Policy Institute based in the Bay Area, and of course, my center, the Center for Urban Environmental Solutions. So now I'm going to introduce distinguished Professor Reid Ewing, who's going to take it from here. Oops, let's see. Reid, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, well, thank you. Welcome, everyone. This is the book, Adaptation Urbanism and Resilient Communities. That's the title. The subtitle is Transforming Streets to Address Climate Change. And that's kind of unusual. What's unusual about it is it's multi-scale. So resilient communities like Rotterdam or Amsterdam, which are featured in the book, that's one scale, geographic scale. And then transforming streets to address climate change is another scale. And this book really spans the scale. So I think of it as kind of a cross between Robert Severo's transit metropolises, which were, regional studies, case studies, and Don Appleyard or maybe Alan Jacobs, great streets and livable streets. And they've managed to bridge that gap in scale in this particular book. And that's what makes it unusual and particularly interesting. So I'm going to save my remarks about the scale and also causality. Do you have to be a Copenhagen or an Amsterdam or a London, uh, three, uh, three regions that are in cities that are featured in the book, to have livable streets? Or can you start with livable streets, maybe one at a time, and add more and eventually end up more Copenhagen-like than, for example, Salt Lake City-like, where I come from? So I will save those remarks for the end, but I want you to keep that in mind. This is the this is the essence of the book: causality, which direction, and scale, scale of the subject matter. I'm going to begin by introducing, and I believe this is what you wanted, John, uh, very briefly, all of the uh, speakers. Billy Fields is going to be first. He's an associate professor of political science at Texas State University. His research focuses on understanding the key elements of resilient communities. He's the lead author of this book, the book we're featuring today in the webinar, and co-editor of Transport Beyond Oil. Then Liliane Geerling, after graduating from Delft University, she's going to be our second speaker. University of Technology. Liliane worked for the city of Rotterdam in various positions, ranging from urban planner to project manager of urban redevelopment development projects in two districts and port areas. Then our next speaker will be another contributor to the book. As John mentioned, there are two authors on the cover page, but there are actually four contributors. And the fourth is Tara Tolford. She's an urban planner and researcher in New Orleans. She's been a researcher with the University of New Orleans, where John was previous to his current position at FAU. Since she's been there since 2011, specializing in active transportation planning, policy, and data. This includes managing regional bike ped projects. And then finally, John, who already mentioned that he and I know each other from Rutgers. I think I may have chaired his doctoral committee. It's been a while, but he's certainly made a name for himself in the area of TOD. I think of Robert Severo and John Renne and just a handful of others who are the top experts on TOD. He's AICP and a professor and director of the Center for Urban and Environmental Solutions in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning in the College of Science at Florida Atlantic University. His previous books include Transport Beyond Oil, which I mentioned before, Transit-Oriented Development, Making It Happen. So those are short introductions, which will allow more time for our presenters. And the first presenter, as I said before, is Billy Fields, and I will turn it over to him right now. And mute myself.
And you're muted, Billy.
There we go. I was sharing and hitting buttons. I'm really excited today to talk with you all. I see some familiar names popping up on the list, and it's exciting to be able to show you what I've been working on for a while with an excellent set of partners. This project really wouldn't be possible without the work of John, Liliane, and Tara. We've all worked together for quite a long time, and it's exciting to be able to share what we've been cooking up together. So one of the things, the way that I came to this is I come from an active transportation advocacy background. I was at Rails to Trails Conservancy as the research director, and then Hurricane Katrina happened, and I'm from New Orleans, and all of a sudden, disasters and mitigation, hazard mitigation became part of what I was thinking about. I then went to the University of New Orleans, and that's where resilience entered my framework, really understanding how cities can sort of address disasters. And there are two ways that cities can address disasters, really. They can bounce back to what they had before, or they can try and bounce forward. And what we found, particularly in the scholarship of resilience over the years, is that bouncing back is not enough. We have too many sort of problems, from climate change to equity to other issues. And what we need to do is figure out how to bounce forward. So conceptually, that's where we start from. And what we do is we take that idea and then place it down at the level of the street so that we can begin to understand not just what resilience means as a broad concept, but what does a resilient street look like? So in terms of context, what you see is that resilience basically in the 1980s and 1990s was very seldom used. It was really the series of disasters in the early 2000s with Katrina, and then the continuing set of disasters with Sandy and other sort of coastal storms that really brought resilience into the forefront. And one of the things that we're looking at when we look at resilience is how do you tie climate adaptation, adapting to the climate change that's already there, with climate mitigation, decreasing greenhouse gas emissions so that we don't end up with worse storms in the future and more significant impacts in the future. So if we're thinking about tying those two pieces together, when we're adapting our infrastructure, we also need to be creating the opportunity to decrease greenhouse gas emissions. So at the forefront of what we're looking at is how do you tie climate adaptation and climate mitigation together? And our focus is really on streets and public spaces. How do you take those big ideas and push them down to the level where you're going to see change? So in terms of kind of the policy problem, what we're looking at here in terms of streets is we have a significant problem. High-speed streets are a driving force behind U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. If you take the sort of main contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, the actual emissions, and then the indirect emissions that come from producing gas, et cetera, you end up to 40% of all emissions come from that sector. In addition, you also have crashes are a significant, unfortunately, contributor to fatalities and serious injuries, and air pollution. When you add those factors together, you have a significant problem. And finally, transportation is the largest land use category in most cities. It represents about 30%, streets represent about 30% of street space. And then when you add parking on top, it can go up to about 40% of city space. So we've got this huge category of land that's generating greenhouse gas emissions and fatalities and serious injuries. And mostly we don't think about it. It just is. And what we did is we traced the ideas of streets, what they meant, and then how we can begin to move from kind of the streets of the past, which you're seeing here in example in Austin, to the streets of the future that are climate adapted and climate mitigated. So the idea is, how do we move from this sort of bounce back approach to transportation that really focuses on the status quo to changing our systems to address social, environmental, and economic weaknesses, to bounce forward from failing systems to produce something better, some streets that really are livable, healthy, and decrease greenhouse gas emissions and are adapted to the changing climate. So what we did is we looked across the literature and we came up with an idea called adaptation urbanism. And it's an exploratory approach. We look at best practices from around the world, and we put these in context of an urban resilience framework. And basically, what we did is came up from that review of the literature, and we found essentially that compact development, sustainable transportation, blue and green infrastructure, and equity are at the core of what creates great streets and public spaces. And what we did is we used those terms to frame our research. And the goal really was to how do we create climate adaptation and climate mitigation and push that down to the level of streets. So in our research, what we did is we looked at case study cities, mostly from the global north, you'll see here. So we looked at Copenhagen, London, Rotterdam, New Orleans, and Miami. We also did a more in-depth analysis in a policy chapter at the end, looking at Amsterdam, Barcelona, Delft, Utrecht, and Vancouver, and looked at what sort of street projects we're seeing there. So as we surveyed these cities around the world, essentially what we found is that in some cities, you're seeing this real jump forward to streets of the future that are using climate adapted and climate mitigated technologies. And in many cities, you didn't see that jump forward. So an example that you see here on the right from Rotterdam, we took the kind of key components of what's making great streets from active transportation perspective, making it safe for walking and biking with traffic calming, brick pavement, permeable pavement. There's a green median, sidewalk, park space, canal, and blue median in the center, and street trees. These kind of elements, when you add them together, create an amazing environment for walking, biking. They decrease greenhouse gas emissions by privileging active transportation and linkages to transit, and they're adapted to climate change. And what we found was in the Netherlands, for example, in this street scene here, there were amazing examples of these type of places. We also found that in Copenhagen, you saw this major jump forward to creating these type of streets. And then in our other case study cities, a kind of scattering of examples. So what we did was we looked at resilience plans in each one of these cities. And then we also did a place analysis, which is what you see here. So we linked plans to places. And as Reid was saying, we linked the idea of kind of a regional city level analysis down to streets. And that was really the idea of linking plans to places to look at what's happening in terms of resilience policy. So how do we bounce forward? As we said, Copenhagen and Rotterdam were really meeting a number of these indicators, and some of our other cities weren't. So an example you see from Rotterdam here is the Zoho Resilience District. We really saw that resilience districts were a great example of pushing these ideas forward, of taking plans and implementing them. And what you see is kind of it actually was a street environment. They turned it into a water garden. The Zoho that you see listed there are actually water barrels that come down from the train tracks above, and they actually fill up with water. And if there's a drought, the water then comes out into the water garden, and they fill up in other times. So what you see is this really opportunity to take street spaces and address water concerns that we may have, whether drought or too much water, and create these spaces that are excellent in terms of livability and connections for walking and biking. So what we essentially are moving towards is moving away from streets being the driving force behind greenhouse gas emissions and high crashes, and then impervious surfaces and spaces of division, and really towards spaces of low greenhouse gas emissions, low to zero crashes, and then places of connection and spaces for water. And what we found was that a number of places in the world are doing that right now. So we're redefining streets. We're moving from the streets of the past, and if you look up the definition of a street, for example, in Webster's, it's that part of a street that is reserved for vehicles. So it's a very narrow definition of streets, and that definition of streets meets Le Corbusier's definition of streets from the 1930s. Le Corbusier said that he would live 30 miles from my office in one direction under a pine tree. My secretary will live 30 miles away from it too in the other direction under another pine tree. We shall both have our own car. We shall use up tires, wear out roads and surfaces and gears, consume oil and gasoline. And that's the type of streets that we've created. We've created streets based around social division. You'll notice Le Corbusier didn't want to live next to his secretary. They've created a 60-mile swath of space between them, and they've used up all of these environmental resources. And in many ways, that's the template of our cities. I'm in Austin, Texas right now, and Austin metro area runs out about 30 miles to the north to Leander, Texas, and runs out about 30 miles to the south down to San Marcos. This is exactly the template that we've created in our cities. But there are tensions that are developing. There are a number of different groups that are pushing back on that framework. But at the same time, the status quo has power. So we see on the left a number of the organizations that tend to pursue the streets of the past. And on the right, what we see is a number of new organizations and new groups, from smart growth to resilience to public health to Vision Zero, who are pushing back on this. And really, what we found in looking at this is that the status quo has power through bureaucratic inertia and siloing. And what we're seeing is the possibility of pushing back and creating a new vision for streets. And that new vision of streets has a really broader definition. Streets are linking spaces that tie communities together, according to NACTO. And we took that definition as a base and we sort of expanded it and argued that streets are public spaces that provide access for movement, public infrastructure, commerce, and public life. And the image that you see on the right is a great example of this from Rotterdam, from Plantage Middenlaan. My Dutch is very poor, so apologies there. And what you see is this used to just be a regular street. There was transit in the middle on concrete. And what they've done is they've taken out the car lanes for a small section. They've expanded cycle tracks. They've got green infrastructure in the center and on the sides to soak up water, and then trams moving through. And what you see here is each one of these trams can hold up to about 100 people. So you've got this really spatially efficient space. Having 100 cars in the same area would feel very different. And what we've got here is this opportunity to really tie spaces together. And when you sit in this space, it's actually really quiet. It's lovely. It's nice. And there's a movement function and a place function to these great new streets. And it does all the big things we've been talking about climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. So here are a couple of examples, and then I'll wrap up. We've got a number of other great examples to dig into. I'll go pretty fast here. But here's an example, and this was really kind of one of the inspirations for the work that we did. This is in Copenhagen. So you see the image up at the top from 2009. In 2011 or 2012, I can't remember which, there was a giant flood. The area flooded, and Copenhagen said, we need to stop doing this. We've got too much asphalt. What we can do is begin to make our streets and public spaces adapted to climate change. And what we see here is Tosingaplads. I'm even worse at Danish. And Tosingaplads was transformed. I interviewed one of the project leads for this project, and he says, the point of Tosingaplads is that it works when it's raining, but more importantly, it works when it's not raining. It's an amazing public space that traffic calms the area, that provides green, and also adds to the businesses of the area. The little cafes have popped up because of the amenity. It's a beautiful space and it works very well. Another space just to the north of this is St. Kelsplads. And this became part of the resilience planning district in the area. And the goal was for Copenhagen to be carbon neutral by 2025, and then carbon adapted, where they can handle 30% more rainfall by 2040. And the image you see at the top, I took, it was just kind of an old asphalty traffic circle. And the image at the bottom is the exact same spot. You see families moving through. You see kind of this mini urban forest that soaks up water. Just an amazing example. It shows you the co-benefits of planning for climate adapted and climate mitigated streets, where you have improved quality of life, decreased pollution, and then space for green and blue infrastructure. And what's great is, this is something that happens in your mind. We need to be climate adapted. We need to be climate mitigated. Well, in reality, it exists. You can go to places and see what's happening. It's really exciting to see these changes. And my favorite small little example of what you can do, you don't have to have a resilience district and make everything happen all at once. This is a street where they added on the left, you can see a little bioswale. It's a bioswale cycle track, and it's perfect. It's very simple. It creates a safe space for walking and biking that decreases greenhouse gas emissions, and it's climate adapted. So what we need to do is stop building streets of the past and start building and retrofitting safe green streets linked to cycle tracks with green infrastructure. We can add the water squares like you saw from Copenhagen before, and then we need to repeat. This is adaptation urbanism in practice. And really quickly, I just want to give you an example of how this could work in a North American context in Vancouver. Small mini traffic circles that slow down traffic. You see green infrastructure inserted into a park setting above, and then small bioswales inserted into the street networks. And then downtown, you add cycle tracks with green separation. This creates safe Vision Zero types of spaces, and it's climate adapted. Really fantastic and straightforward. We have the technology to do this today. We don't need, and we can always use more technology, that's good, but we know what to do. We just need the political will to do it. And when we do this, you also create great spaces. So here's my last example. What if we closed a street to cars, added better water management, added cafe seating, and a piano? You can see the red circle at the bottom. There's a guy playing piano. The cafe owners basically sort of are in charge of this. When it rains, they just come out, they put a tarp on top. It's amazing. If we do these type of things, we create better places for people, we adapt ourselves to climate change, and we put ourselves on the pathway to limit our greenhouse gas emissions. These are the type of things that are possible if we make change. So with that, I will pass the baton to Liliane Geerling, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about Rotterdam and the changes that she's seen in her neighborhood in Rotterdam.
As moderator, I'll feel the privilege of pointing out that we're going to have to go a little faster to get through the whole thing in questions and answers by the end of the hour. So Liliane, please go ahead.
Yes, I can do it very quickly. And thanks, Billy, for the first introduction. So you already have a little bit of an idea what some cities might or already look like. The city that I'm currently seated is the city that I live in. I've been born and raised in the city. It's the second largest city of the Netherlands, Rotterdam. Almost 700,000 inhabitants. It's the biggest port city of Europe still. And what you see is actually the port is now at sea. And there's quite some climate challenges that the city is faced with. Among others, subsidence, flooding, sea level rise, housing that are built on wooden piles, so the foundation might start rotting if the groundwater level is not managed properly. In the past years, we had extreme rainfall events. Of course, nothing compared to New Orleans, but still. And we also are facing more and more heat waves. So the city started working on the adaptation urbanism, but it wasn't called that way a long time ago. But they forgot a little bit about it, I think, since the Second World War, where the city, the center of the city was bombed by the Nazis, and the rebuilding started in the 50s, so it was very much car-oriented. But in recent years, the city started rediscovering the old good things that they used to do, and they start working on the city to improve it and make it climate resilient. So they focus on, for instance, adding a lot of green roofs, making water squares, so using public space to store temporarily water, adding a lot of permeable pavement, setting up energy cooperatives, making floating housing, floating farms, tidal parks, so using the water as an asset again, like they used to do 200 years back. So the picture on the right is actually, you see in the back my street. And this is a canal built in the 1930s. So as you can see, until today, it kept its value for temporarily storing rainwater, but mainly also for having a nice walk and relaxing in the grass. And the one on the left is even older. It's 150 years old. And you see a combination of walking, biking. It's also still for cars, but also the tram is in the grass. There's also water. It's a beautiful space and it's still working. But to have
Liliane,
these spaces,
I'm
yes.
sorry to interrupt you, but I think you might need to advance your slides. We can't see the future slides.
Oh, sorry. Now you can. So this was the old canals. So I have to still put them on to go forward. So the new strategy of the city, can you see the current one, is adding water squares. So what they literally do is looking per neighborhood how much water storage is needed, and then translate that into public space to make amenities that are 24/7 actually very nice to visit. And only in times of heavy rainfall they can store a lot of the rainwater that's just needed 5% of the time. I think this is the most famous water square. Many people from abroad come and visit this one. So you can do it in a green way, in a soft way, but you can also do it in a more architectural way. Around this square, there are many office buildings. There's a big school. There's all kinds of amenities. There's also a church, as you can see. And the rainwater from the rooftops, but also from the surface, is leaded to those three basins. So when it's a heavy rainstorm, like we had a few days back, it fills up. And then when the sewage is empty again, so the water is relieved, as you can see here. So then it's looking like this. And then it's still a nice square. You can still play with it. It's just a little bit different. So this very simple measure of changing pavements, and you can do it in historic neighborhoods and use the red ones, but also in newer streets. It's just a simple way of making the whole area more permeable. So not putting all the money in enlarging the sewage system, which is very expensive, but making nice public spaces that are always nice. So in Rotterdam, they also have now a program where you can challenge the city. So I'm no longer working for the city government. I'm now working for University of Applied Sciences and train students on water management and spatial planning and the combination of the two. But this is my street where I'm living, and the municipality wanted to develop a new plan for this. We had some issues with storing rainwater. There was sometimes water on the pavement. But also cars were going way too fast. It was not safe. So what we did was also, and we had the canal next to us, add more green spaces, did traffic calming, and also added all kind of nice amenities. So we made the whole plan, together with all inhabitants. So we challenged the municipality and we got some money to organize the whole participatory planning, but also make the design ourselves. So what you see now is that people have these rain barrels, so the water from the rooftop is being used for watering the plants. So yeah, everyone is having more awareness about what can happen due to climate change and that everything is needed. But also the social aspect of resilience are improved because many of these big green spaces are now adapted by the local people and they take care of it and they involve young kids in it, so it's very nice. So yeah, you can see big scale examples in Rotterdam and small scales. Like I told in the beginning, Rotterdam was very much a car-oriented city for many years, but also the current government is now very much focused on improving the mobility towards more biking and also walking. So they see that also the car usage is going down. Many young people don't want to have a car anymore. They want to own a car anymore. And what was very nice is that just recently, last November, the majority within the city council voted for that all the streets where it's possible should be changed into a 30-kilometer street. And probably you all know that the casualties will go down a lot when it's changed from 50 kilometers per hour into 30. And where this is being implemented is in the main street of Rotterdam. So the building on the left is the city hall, one of the few buildings that survived the bombardment. And this street is just reopened. It's so, like I said, it's the main street. There were extra trees added in this street, but the main issue is 2 lanes of cars are taken out. You see the tram going on. There's also underground subway. You can't see it, obviously, it's underground. You see a wide lane for bikes, and there's a lot of space for pedestrians. So this is now going to be the boulevard, a real city lounge where you can really have fun, enjoy yourself, sit on the benches, meet people, and only 2 lanes left for cars and in slower speed as well as before. So just in very briefly, some of the examples that we had. So this is my last slide.
Okay. Sorry, Reid, I think you're on mute. We're going to have Tara Tolford as our next.
Tara's next, and I think we're still facing a time crunch.
Thanks. Well, I talk quickly, so we'll get through. So next, we're taking you back across the ocean to a U.S. city that has been grappling with really the existential threat that is presented by climate change in the context of both a long recovery from a major disaster, as well as deep issues of economic and environmental justice that are really complicate resilience planning. That also highlights the imperative for an adaptation urbanism approach and the opportunity to integrate mitigation strategies into climate response. That city is New Orleans, where I live now, where Billy's from, where John spent a decade. And it's a case study in the book that we think really illustrates the equity challenges of resilience planning in the context of a movement for changing how we design and use our streets. So New Orleans is an old city by US standards, at least 300 years old with Europeans and populated by indigenous people before that. Important for its strategic location along the river, its connections by land and water to Lake Pontchartrain, to the resources of the Mississippi River Delta. So water is why this city exists, as well as being an ongoing threat to its existence. As we've seen in other Delta cities around the world, technological advances in the 20th century really allowed us to push back and pump out the water that was all around us, hiding it away in pipes and behind complex levee systems, which allowed and encouraged outward expansion into ever lower lying areas that were made all the more vulnerable over time by soil compaction and subsidence. And these 20th century below sea level neighborhoods also tended to be more auto-dependent in character, and in many cases, thanks to racist zoning policies and longstanding patterns of wealthier residents locating on higher ground, these were disproportionately also home to Black and lower income residents. The result was that by the time Hurricane Katrina struck in 2005, we had deep inequalities that were just built into the landscape that resulted in very inequitable impacts from that disaster, both in terms of who actually flooded and in terms of the ability to rebuild and recover long term. So in the years that followed, as Billy alluded to, resilience really became a ubiquitous part of the dialogue around recovery, with a lot of effort and thinking that was focused on how do we imagine both the city's physical footprint as well as its relationship with water, and how do we identify new ways to mitigate risks and improve quality of life. On the other hand, that was all happening in parallel with the more urgent need to rebuild as fast as possible and get people back in their homes. And this tension between Billy's framing of bouncing back to how things were before disaster versus bouncing forward to a more resilient and less hazardous future was and is defined by the risk of doing even greater harm to the already marginalized, already disinvested communities who were the most impacted in the first place within a system that was really rigged against them. So basically, New Orleans came to a process of resilience planning with the baggage of decades or centuries of unjust land use and infrastructure decision-making that was exacerbated by contemporary impacts of flood risk and livability, however that is defined, on land values and housing prices. So we know that investing in green infrastructure in safe and comfortable places that are less vulnerable to climate change and to disasters can put pressure on housing prices. And this can mean that that process of pushing less affluent residents out to lower or less adapted neighborhoods continues or accelerates, perpetuating the cycle of inequitable exposure to risk, to reduced economic opportunity that's made worse by increasingly unaffordable insurance premiums in our case. We describe this kind of climatological gentrification as really a pre-existing condition in New Orleans that accelerated after Katrina and continues today. And it's exacerbated and complicated by countless other factors that add up to really a critical threat to the city's culture and to its people. So if we're going to adapt and bounce forward from here, we first need to address these very deep racial and economic inequities. So illustrating both the risks and the opportunities that are inherent in resilience work, there is a lot that has been done, and there's a whole lot more that's currently underway in terms of advancing both adaptation and mitigation strategies in New Orleans. Much of it is focused on managing stormwater or on reimagining our use of our streets and public spaces, or in some cases both. So the city has developed a robust suite of resilience plans. And from these, it's drawn a lot of pilot projects at different scales that seek to change our relationship to water and at the same time create new public amenities. So some of the examples of these include a series of small-scale stormwater projects that double as mini parks in the neighborhoods, as well as the very massive suite of projects under the greater umbrella of the Gentilly Resilience District, which is a grant-funded multi-project endeavor that is applying a whole lot of water management tools at different scales to one of New Orleans' biggest and most diverse neighborhoods. And this includes redeveloping some highly auto-oriented suburban-type arterials as blue streets, which would bring key active transportation connections and well as transform water into a community asset. We also have projects like the Lafitte Greenway, that is a shared use trail that has quickly become really a main artery for active transportation and a hub of civic life, as well as a locus of some green infrastructure experimentation and some demonstration projects. But then on the other hand, it's also a flashpoint for discussions about the potential unintended consequences of adding amenity-centered greenways to neighborhoods that are already undergoing rapid gentrification and seeing escalating housing costs. Simultaneously, the city has come to understand that the water economy and adaptation are an important economic and workforce opportunity and has been investing in developing this sector with now a focus on racial and economic equity. So as with the Gentilly Resilience District, this is largely a grant-funded effort at this point, but the idea is that these are supposed to lead to bigger systemic changes in our policy and our planning that will make that kind of integrated thinking more of the status quo in the future. In the meantime, things are a little slow. Progress is kind of uneven, and we've missed some opportunities along the way, but we're making progress. So meanwhile, New Orleans has also been tackling one piece of the other side of the climate coin, which is the emissions mitigation by encouraging non-automobile forms of transportation. New Orleans has always been a city where a lot of people walk and bike. This has only increased in recent years in concert with consistent incremental investments in better infrastructure. So most recently, the city made a commitment to add 75 miles of new bikeways over 2 years, and the implementation of that is underway as we speak. And for the first time, these projects were really explicitly intended to center on lower income neighborhoods, communities of color that had previously really been left out of where new bikeway infrastructure was coming in. And also their neighborhoods that have high rates of no vehicle households in the first place. And so while a lot of the new mileage of bikeways in this case is coming from just simple roadway reconfigurations and not necessarily physically reducing the amount of space that we are paving overall, increasingly streets projects are starting to be considered more holistically to do multiple things, to address drainage, to manage stormwater, as well as adapting for multimodal transportation needs. So several of the recent projects that have recently incorporated green infrastructure elements have been developed. And the city now has a policy on the books that says that wherever feasible, and there's a number of instances, particularly involving active transportation where this is the case, permeable materials must be used rather than concrete and asphalt. The city also very recently inked an agreement with a local tree planting nonprofit to greatly expand the city's tree canopy. And a lot of these plantings are being coordinated on the corridors where new sidewalks or bikeways are planned. And so where these street projects are intersecting with green infrastructure projects, the results can be really transformative. And we're just beginning to see the impacts and the possibilities of this holistic approach. We have a lot of places with a lot of little baby trees, but give it some time and we'll really start to see some of the images that we've been seeing from other cities that are a little further along in this process. And importantly, some of the credit for these shifts has really just come from persistent advocacy. That includes work like the work of the interdisciplinary New Orleans Complete Streets Coalition, which made the step of explicitly including green infrastructure in its proposed policy language around complete streets and its implementation recommendations. And it's continuing to push for broadening that understanding of what complete streets means to be not just about bike lanes, but to help residents and policymakers understand the possibilities and the benefits of these kind of changes. So despite numerous promising advances and a lot of progress, there's definitely still a lot of work to be done here. As with pretty much everywhere, COVID-19 has exacerbated existing economic inequalities. New Orleans' huge tourism sector has been very deeply impacted, and there's not really an end in sight in terms of increasing housing prices. In addition, we still have really serious safety issues to grapple with on our streets, so the mitigation potential of active transportation is still held back by our failure to meaningfully address these risks, especially on state corridors and other sort of trickier areas where local efforts haven't gone as far yet. But the Green Streets approach that the city has begun to embrace is a really powerful tool for addressing both the flooding that impacts us on a seemingly weekly basis. I think we're still under a flash flood watch today. We were under one yesterday. It seems daily instead of weekly these days. But it's also a way to take steps toward reducing emissions and meet the ambitious climate goals that we have set, while potentially enhancing community cohesion and livability for everyone. Importantly, though, that cannot be done. Resilience planning cannot bounce us forward unless equity is really at the core of both the adaptation and the mitigation efforts. And specifically, in the face here of the effects of gentrification from multiple fronts and causes, and also reflecting our unjust histories of settlement and displacement, that really means that centering affordable housing is going to be an integral facet, or really a prerequisite, of resilience planning moving forward. With that, I will kick it back to John to take us back into the overarching themes, I believe.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen, and I'm going to just speak very quickly. I don't have much. So this is one of the outcomes of the book. I went there. I test rode this cool cargo bike, and I put this slide up there because it illustrates, on a daily basis. I don't just study the stuff. I actually live it. I feel it. I'm a cyclist. I know what it feels like to feel unsafe on the streets when you're biking your kids to school. I live in West Palm Beach. My kids go to school on the Barrier Island at public school. And during king tides, we actually have to go through salt water because of sea level rise during king tides, several times a year. And so in order to just kind of wrap this up, what are the adaptation urbanism policy implications? You saw, this is New Orleans on the left. I moved to New Orleans 2 weeks before Hurricane Katrina. This is Miami, South Florida on the right. And we're experiencing king tide flooding for, 60 days a year in South Florida, and it's increasing. Part of the obstacles that we've identified have to do with silos. We operate in the transportation world, in the water management world, the environmental coastal management world, right? And those silos don't work, right? Because one, disasters don't care about professional silos, right? They come through, they wreak havoc, especially the more silos we have, the worse off we are. And disasters don't care about political boundaries. On the right here, this shows a map of what South Florida would look like under a high scenario flooding modeled by the Army Corps of Engineers in 80 years from now, in the year 2100. And on the left is Superstorm Sandy, which barreled into New York about, I don't know, maybe 12, 13 years ago. And was at the time one of the most costliest disasters, and just completely overtook so many states and cities and municipal boundaries. So how do we bounce forward? I share this image with you. This is not covered in the book, but this is from Seoul, South Korea, because I think this might be one of the most illustrative examples in the world. This used to be a highway that was stacked over this river in Seoul. And the mayor had a bold vision and he uncovered the stream and he turned it into a multimodal corridor that is now safe in the heart of a major metropolitan city with millions of people and so much traffic. So what we're proposing, in order proposing this bouncing forward idea, in integrating, adapting our infrastructure and mitigating against future climate emissions, is we need to re-envision our streets as a central resilience platform, not just to achieve one goal, but to broaden out and look at safety, climate, equitability, and efficiency of space through different modes. We want to substantively link the funding to the core outcomes of the policy concerns in the climate change era. And we want to, from a political standpoint, look towards building a linked agenda across these different, very worthwhile initiatives like Vision Zero and equity and climate and smart growth and public health, and begin to better stitch them across, and it happens at, Reid said, multiple scales, at the local scale, the regional scale, and at the state and national scales. So with that, I'm going to just do the slide, Billy, because of time constraints. We want to ask you the question, how would you prioritize space on your street to make it more welcoming? What can we do? And I'm going to turn it over to Reid because we pretty much, I think, run out of most time. But he's going to share some thoughts, and maybe we might get to one or two of your questions. So thank you.
Yeah, hi. I think I'm unmuted now. One of the questions that was asked by Shannon, I believe, is the Netherlands is such a great example of how to do livable, equitable green streets. Given land use patterns in the US, how do we ever move toward a model like what we see in the Netherlands? And I'm going to address that from the standpoint of the authors, their concluding chapter. And this will only take about 2 minutes, I believe, so it'll leave time for other questions. So they in bridging this gap between the region and the large region and the individual street, they say adaptation urbanism is about creating a new vision of the resilient cities. So you have initially a new vision. They say then number two, stop building streets of the past and start building and retrofitting safe green streets linked to cycle tracks with green infrastructure, add water squares in key public spaces, and then repeat. They then say cities should begin with pilot projects. So the pilot projects essentially are building blocks for creating a sustainable and resilient region. Resilient districts, much like we found in Copenhagen. So we have these pilot projects, and then everyone wants the same thing, so they replicate themselves. Where the green infrastructure challenge emerges as new amenities, you can have pressure on housing costs. So they're recognizing that housing affordability is an issue that will have to be dealt with. Key to the process that links green infrastructure and affordable housing development, the key is that resilient city becomes a more equitable city. So they're not overlooking gentrification in all of this. And then finally, they end with the vision of this book has been collectively shaped by the stories of local victories and failures, of struggle and places transformed. And that's the strength of the book. I think I mentioned you can get it on Amazon now. I pre-ordered it, came a couple days ago, so I didn't have a chance to read the whole thing. What I read it was a very good read, and I would urge you all to buy copies and learn about this multi-scale process they're describing. So we're not all Copenhagen. I'm in Salt Lake City, but we can become more Copenhagen-like by following their prescriptions. So with that, there was a very good question, which I'll turn over to John or Billy or one of the other speakers. How do you get around ITE and MUTCD and the AASHTO Green Book and so on guidelines that create these streets that are neither green nor livable?
Yeah, let me start, and I'd like to kind of ask Billy to jump in. I've known the Carlos Hernandez, who's one of the leading transportation planners in Colorado, who asked that question, and we graduated undergraduate together and worked together. It's a great question, and I suspect Carlos probably has a better answer than I would. But what I would say is that you have to have data in order to be able to combat the ITE and a lot of these standards. And that's exactly the kind of work that Reid does is, he measures things, he does studies. You look at TODs, you look at how many trips do they actually generate, and what does the ITE say they're going to generate? And that is, I mean, I'm more of an expert in transportation, but I suspect we have the same sorts of issues when we're talking about water management in our streets as well. So, Billy, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, John, you nailed it there. One of the things we really identify is kind of the bureaucratic inertia of standards and rules, and those standards and rules really prevent us. And throughout the book, we identified that as a key barrier. And this is the hard part. We just need to push through this. In the places that we've seen that have really done this, like your Copenhagen's and Rotterdam's and other places in the Netherlands, they also had these types of barriers in place and they pushed through them. And what we need to do is really start measuring what matters and then funding what matters on top of that. If we're serious about climate change, if we're serious about resilience, we need to stop repeating the patterns of the past. And really what we identify is that if we bounce back, this sort of bounce back resilience, what we get is the same streets of the past. And we need a new plan. We need to not privilege the status quo in the way we've been doing, but start from scratch and really re-examine these standards because they're not working. They generate high greenhouse gas emissions. They generate high crashes, social division, pollution, these type of things that they're not working. We need a new system. And really, we're not going to see that system until we get a lot more push. And that push can be at city level, but it also needs to go up to these standard making and rule-making bodies as well. It's hard.
I'd like to add something maybe that's nice for you to understand or to hear. Organized competitions. In the Netherlands, probably you know that between the soccer teams of Rotterdam and Amsterdam, there's fierce competition. Well, in soccer, Amsterdam won. But in getting tiles out of gardens, Rotterdam won. So they challenged citizens to get as many tiles out of their garden, and then there's all kind of subsidies from the city government. Replace that with plants, with grass, with something that uptakes water, because also the city government is measuring and monitoring and realizing that they cannot solve it all in public space. So they also need private spaces. They need inner courtyards owned by housing corporations. They need gardens of private persons. They need rooftops of buildings that are not owned by the government. But by giving this subsidy, but also showing examples, collaborating and competition, and making it fun sometimes as well. Yeah, that is hoping to entice people, but also to get more awareness about, that everyone can join in from the very small scale to the maybe bigger scale.
Yeah, John mentioned our work on TOD. We've also done work on sprawl at the regional level and urban design qualities at the street level. So we've measured the built environment at 5 different scales and then related it to outcomes. like, for example, life expectancy at the regional scale and pedestrian activity at the street scale. There's a great question here, and I think this will probably end it for us. What makes a resilience plan different from other types of plans? This is from Louis, I believe, or Louise. Does a resilience plan have to respond to or anticipate a natural hazard? So for all the speakers, what is the answer to that great question?
Can I make a recommendation that Tara take a stab at that, since she actually evaluated all the different plans and all the cities that we looked at? I think you're on mute, Tara.
One of the pieces that we dug into as sort of the framing, the underlying foundation of this book, under which we looked at all of these different case studies, is just digging out all of their plans and watching the evolution of those plans from something that was really sort of project based, just sort of a wish list of projects that they would like to see, to starting to get at really the underlying policy changes that that create transformational change. And often that is, in your design guidelines, and setting specific goals and having evaluation mechanisms by which to measure those goals. So it's really been, we've seen the evolution of the resilience plan from a sort of underdeveloped buzzwordy idea to a much broader framing device that has reach into so many different areas as well. Billy, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just real quickly, Copenhagen is probably the most interesting of the plans to see that evolution. Really, our plan analysis, we took lots of different plans because the resilience plans is still kind of evolving. But what you saw in Copenhagen was this tying of climate mitigation and adaptation together. In many of the other resilience plans, you really saw a focus on climate adaptation, particularly at the local level, but not tying climate mitigation together. But in Copenhagen, you're starting to see this real jump forward of tying the two together. And maybe a good way to envision it is through that example that I gave early on of the cycle track connected to the bioswale. Like, all these ideas are really big, right? But we can start at the street level by making it safer to walk and bike and connecting in green infrastructure. If you do that and you add those elements up to the regional level, you start to make a difference in terms of climate change, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and in terms of adaptation across scales. So it's really building from individual streets up. And the best examples we saw were in Copenhagen, from a planning perspective, but in the Netherlands, conversely, they just do it. They're not in the plans, aren't necessarily there in the same way. They're always layering on that active transportation on top of the adaptation. So I really enjoyed both of those, and you're seeing bubbles of that in the New Orleans plans and some of that in Miami as well.
Yeah, and I just want to thank everybody, in particular. I want to thank all of the speakers. I want to thank Reid Ewing, our host, and I want to thank Serena Herman, who actually was really the host and putting all this together, and making sure this all worked. I also want to let you know that Billy and I are going to be doing other webinars for other groups about the book. We're going to dig into other aspects of the books. Like, we have a wonderful chapter, on Copenhagen, a wonderful chapter on London. We heard a little bit about Rotterdam and New Orleans. We have a very interesting chapter on South Florida, and other examples from across Europe and North America. We're doing a webinar with Carl Kim's group out of Hawaii. We have one next week with TRB. If you're interested in any of those, shoot us an email. There in the chat window, there's an email address, qs@fau.edu. We can send you invites to some of those other ones, and we may also do another webinar that digs more specifically in some of these other case studies. So thank you all so much. Thanks again to all of our sponsors for sharing the word and for participating with us. And it was great to see many of you and many familiar faces. Thank you so much.